Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Today I'll be going over how I made the pattern and put together the aqua metallic Shantung bodice that you recently saw in my Arcana lookbook, of course here paired with the matching full-length skirt for a more evening wear look. And it sounds like what caught people's eye the most about this design was the raised pointed back collar, or the back neckline of this. It's actually a very simple modification to go ahead and add on, so let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And I begin as usual with my basic bodice block. I have a tracing of that with both of its darts, and I've just added a 1/2 inch along the center front there. I'm going to be separating this into a princess seam, so I'm going to go ahead and put a line from the apex up into the neckline here to transform our dart fullness into a neckline princess. And then I will go ahead and modify the neckline by raising it from the shoulder. To do this, I come out a 1/2 inch along the shoulder seam from the neckline and then 1.5 inches up in this case. I'll just blend that down into the shoulder seam and then curve down into the center front here, just whipping my pen to create that curve there. Of course, you could use a curved ruler or a French curve ruler, that kind of thing, if you are less comfortable drawing curves. I will go ahead and tip my shoulder up 1/4 inch and out 1/4 inch along my arm side here, and I will lower the arm side a 1/2 inch as well, just because this is going to technically be kind of a jacket bodicey thing, and therefore I'm going to do the same sort of outerwear modifications that I normally make when I'm going to be wearing something underneath a jacket. So I've added a 1/4 inch along the side seam as well here, just for a little bit of extra room, so I can wear this over a blouse or some kind of undershirt at the very least. And then right here at the waist from the dart point to the center front, I'm just going to drop this down pointed about 1.5 inches in the front, maybe 2 inches, like so, just so this has a center front point for this particular version of this bodice. Then I will go ahead and start cutting this out so we can do our manipulation into the princess seam here. And we can see that for once, I remember, instead of cutting it apart, to add my notches first. So 2 inches up from the apex along the princess seam and then 2 inches down. I'm just going to use my ruler to make sure that those are precise. I'm going to add little black bars as notches so that I know where to line these princess seams up later on when I'm sewing these together. So now I can go ahead and eliminate this dart entirely. We don't need that dart fullness anymore. It will be taken out along this style line, and I can actually eliminate the side dart as well, just closing that from the apex to the side seam, closing that side dart up, smoothing off the side seam, and we now have this as a princess seamed garment. This is, of course, not a shoulder princess or an armhole princess. This is up into the neckline, so I'm just going to call this a neckline princess. This is actually my favorite princess seam to use. It just goes together so effortlessly. It's not that I have trouble with other princess seams, I just hold my breath a little bit more, and these just go together so nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and add seam allowance along this princess seam here. Of course, each side will still need seam allowance. And I'm just going to tape this together for a moment because I'm just going to draw on a curve to the front of this as an indication to do embroidery later that I, of course, didn't end up doing. But I wanted to kind of add a almost necklace-looking yoke-shaped chain of office onto this garment itself. I didn't end up having time to do that with this particular garment, and I ended up wearing this with the Order of the Beaded Beetle instead. So still got that same sort of vibe, but I would love to do an embroidered collar on one of these in the future, so I did have that already indicated here on my pattern. But the front of this is ready to go for now, so let's work on the back. Again, a tracing of my basic bodice block. Instead of having the 1 inch seam allowance down the center back that I normally leave for zippers when I'm making a dress or something like that, because this will just be closed along the center back, I'm going to leave a 1/2 inch. I still will make my same modifications that I did to the front, adding a 1/4 inch along the side seam, tip up and out of the shoulder seam that 1/4 inch as well. I will copy the curve from the front neckline straight here onto the back, and then I'm going to tip out the top 4 inches or so of the center back just to accommodate the curve of the neck and this collar. I'm actually going to raise the very back of this up a little bit and have it point at the center back behind my neck as well, and I'll leave the top 4 inches or so of that not only flared outwards like this, but also open, which just gives me a little bit more flexibility in being able to turn my head around and things like that with this higher collar in the back. And it looks very pointy and slightly villainous as well, so that is always a plus. I will separate the back into a princess seam as well, so I've just drawn from the dart point up into the arm side here. You could put that into the shoulder, you could put it into the neckline, anywhere you would like, just like on the front. It's a little bit different for the back like this because it's just a pivot point for the dart as opposed to an apex in the same way that the front is, but really you can throw this dart anywhere in the back as well. But I'll separate this into its princess seam, again eliminating that dart fullness into the style line, and I can go ahead and add seam allowance along that back princess seam as well. And then I'm just going to kind of use the front orange curve embroidery indication here to draw another indication on the back for the, again, embroidery that I did not end up doing for this project. But I wanted to have that idea in place before I started working on this and realized there's just no way that I was going to have time to do that. That's it for the front and back bodice portion of this. Let's start working from the waist down. I'm going to take a tracing of my A-line front skirt pattern to create the sort of peplum of my bodice or jacket here. I will add on that same 1/4 inch that I used for the bodice to the side seam of this as well, just allowing that to flare from beyond the hip anyhow, because I mean, I'm not going to make this that long anyway, so it's not that big of a difference. And I'll have the skirt portion of this bodice just line up with where the princess seam is at the top, so it's not going all the way to the center front, it's just ending where the princess seam ends. So this is my front peplum. Here's the grain line that was originally on this pattern. Go ahead and cut this out. I end up making this a tiny bit longer, so I tape on a tiny bit more paper here, so I can add another 1/2 inch to this. This is probably around 7 inches long along the side and about 9 down the center front. This, of course, is the easiest way to make peplums ever. It's a good reason to have the A-line skirt pattern sitting around. I need to make a card version sometime, at least of like the top 12 inches of it, because I do use this all the time when I'm drafting jackets or anything that has something going on from the waist down, really. Just making sure that matches up with the side bodice piece before I start working on the back here. Again, I'm just going to use a 1/2 inch down the center back of this piece as well for the back from the waist down. Again, just tracing my back A-line skirt pattern here, like so. I need to, again, add that same bit of extra and flare along the side seam that I did to the bodice of this pattern, so just copying that from the first piece here, like so, making sure I have the side seam that will all line up, so I'm making that the same length, and again, it will dip down a little bit further down the center back, just to come to a point in the back, like so. And I will actually be creating 3 different sleeve patterns to put this all together today. We have a little cap sleeve, and then we have the puff sleeve that goes under it. We have the puff and the under sleeve for both of that. So there's 3 pieces total. I'm going to tape my shoulder seam together here on my front and back bodice pieces and just trace the arm side flat like this, because I want to make a little cap sleeve that comes out over the shoulder, but comes out straight from the shoulder. So it doesn't curve over my shoulder in any way. It just juts straight out from my shoulder. So I'm just tracing this arm side, I guess, from the top down. If you were hovering above me and looking down, it's kind of what we're doing here now. Just making sure that lines up, seeing how far I want to have that come out past the shoulder. I have added seam allowance onto that traced curve line there. I don't know if this is the best way to do this, but it was the way I did it on this particular day. So there's that. There's other ways to draft a piece like this, that's for sure. I do think I want to make this a little bit bigger and longer for my next version of this bodice. And I definitely do like this idea, and I want to expand upon it and use it again. I would love to have a black version of this garment, which I could say about everything, honestly. If I don't have a black version of something, it can be assumed that I want a black version. And I have some black cotton piqué left over from some projects from last year that I think I might have enough to make one of these out of that. So I'll have to see. Could end up on my project list here to make another version of this in black. So that's my first little sleeve cap addition here that's just going to jut out from the shoulder. Help give me a strong shoulder, because we all know I like a strong shoulder. The wider the shoulder, the smaller the waist, as the 1940s taught us. And the 1890s for that matter. And the 1830s. Anytime with large sleeves, you know. I'm going to trace the top third of my sleeve pattern here and just bring the sides in. I'm going to taper those about another 1/2 inch further from usual, just to make them fit a little bit closer to my arm. This is going to be the undersleeve, the base that my puff sleeve will be attached to. I'm not going to add any puff to this sleeve cap. I'm just going to keep it as is. So this is aqua bodice undersleeve. And I can go ahead and cut this out. I'm actually going to tape some scrap pieces of paper together here instead of getting a new sheet, just so that I can trace another copy of my undersleeve here that I will then use to modify and add puff to make the oversleeve. So I have this pattern once again, and I'm going to split it down the center and down the sides and add in some flare here. So first thing I'll do is I'll raise that sleeve cap about at least a good inch and a quarter here from the center, and then I'll split this with 3 lines about 3 inches out from the center on either side. I'll add in 3/4 of an inch to the bottom as well. So we have extra length in the sleeve cap and in the hem itself, adding some puff, and then I will go ahead and, of course, expand along these 3 lines here to add in more fullness at both the cuff of this sleeve and a little bit at the top of the sleeve as well. Past me feels like she's adding plenty of puff here, but in the end, I think I could have gone further with the puff. When you're trying to have a big sleeve, it's really hard to actually go too far, really, depending on the fabric. The next one of these I want to make, I do want to make the sleeves puffier, but at the same time, cotton piqué is really thick, so it might be annoying to do so. A way around that would be to do like cartridge pleating for the bottom of the sleeve, but I've never done that before. So we'll see what I end up going with in the end. But I'm adding in a wedge of fullness down the center, and then 2 wedges of fullness either side. So I've added in about an inch to the center of the top of the sleeve puff, as you can see, which in addition to raising the sleeve cap will add a little bit of puff up there, and then plenty of puff to the cuff of this although still not quite enough. I will dip the back of this down just a tiny bit more, but honestly, again, something I could have exaggerated just because it's nice to have the back of your sleeves even puffier than the front. And this is what is done for bishop sleeves, at least long bishop sleeves. So something that I figured I should do on this, but again, I could have exaggerated it further. Alas, that's the moral of the story for this particular puff sleeve. I could have puffed further, you know? And I will go ahead and cut out the undersleeve as well, since I hadn't cut it out yet. And then I will have the cap, the puff sleeve, and the undersleeve. I'll cut the cap, undersleeve, and oversleeve all out of the aqua metallic fabric I'm using today. It's like an aqua metallic shantung. It's the same shantung that I made that corset out of recently. I'm just using the aqua colorway here to make this piece today. And then I will also cut the undersleeve out of my lining fabric today as well, just because the shantung is a little bit stiff and wouldn't be terribly uncomfortable against the skin, but lining is going to be much smoother. So I will go ahead and line the undersleeve as well. I wanted the structure of this same fabric for the undersleeve, but I wanted the smoothness of the lining. So in the end, these sleeves are many, many layers, and yet somehow I still managed to get them all into the arm side. So you'll see it becomes a little bit of a struggle later just because this metallic shantung does like to fray. And you will see what that looks like on the machine later. So I have started pinning some of this together after I cut everything out of both the shantung and the lining. I didn't do any interlining for this because, again, this shantung is rather crispy all on its own with that lurex blended in. It holds its structure well, and you'll see that again when we get to the puff sleeves because they just look like little balloons. But for lining these sleeve caps, I wanted something equally crispy but a little bit thinner, so I went with this sort of antique brass olive-toned tissue weight taffeta that I had in my stash. I still have lots of olive green silk floating around from when I was trying to find the perfect color to use to make leaves for the whippy gown earlier in the year. So I still have some random bits of silk laying around. So I did use this antique gold sort of olive-toned fabric to line the peplum and then the little sleeve caps for this particular project, especially because I didn't have a ton of this lovely paisley rayon lining. So I sewed my center backs in both the shantung and the lining fabric here. This lining fabric I picked up from a shop here in Colorado in Boulder called Alfredi's. It's an excellent, like, sort of luxury fabric store. They do have some quilting cotton as well. Plenty of quilting cotton, actually. But they specialize in fine European fabrics. So if you need something real fancy and you're in the Boulder area, that's where I would go. I would say that Alfredi's is the only other fine fabric store I know of in Colorado besides Allen's. It's just Allen's and Alfredi's. They're the best if I need to shop locally. And they did have this absolutely gorgeous lining there. I love a patterned or like jacquarded rayon lining. If I can't get a jacquarded one, I want a twill, something with a little bit more going on than a plain weave, because I love a plainly woven rayon lining, like a Bemberg lining, for the feel of it, but using it is just so slippery. And at least if it has something going on in the weave, either a twill, a herringbone, or a jacquard weave of some kind, it makes it a lot easier to deal with, or at least a little bit easier to deal with, and a little bit goes a long way when it comes to slippery lining. So I really prefer a jacquarded rayon for a lining every time. And of course they are also very pretty, so that helps as well. But I'll start sewing my princess seams for the back here. So these are my back princess seams. I pinned that in the lining and then here in the shantung as well. Set that aside. I can go ahead and start sewing my peplum pieces together as well. Here's the center back seam. I only sewed about 4 inches of that in the outside of the back skirt pieces, but I can line up the side seams of those shortly. I also can clip my corners and flip these little tiny sleeve caps right side out and give them a quick press, like so. Press those into place. You can see a little bit more the true color of this lining over here. The fabric, this like shantung, it's got aqua acetate, then gold lurex, and sort of a black polyester, I want to say, super fine thread. So it's a blend of black, gold, and aqua. So it does kind of have this little bit of an olive-toned gold running through it. So I think in person, this silk is a really good match for that. It's a little bit more contrasty here on camera, but in person, I think it matches quite well. And I can just go ahead and sew everything I've prepped and pinned in that last round over here on the machine, just using 12 stitches per inch as usual, using my Gutermann all-purpose thread as usual as well. Anything that's too wrinkled, of course, I'm giving a quick press as I go here. I will just grab my pattern pieces and make sure I have my notches marked with pins on my pieces here. I marked it in colored pencil as well, but I think I was getting confused, so I just wanted to remake sure that I had everything ready to go. And again, it's actually very easy to line up the pieces for the neckline princess here, just because everything, you're doing a convex to a convex as opposed to a convex to a concave. So it's just much easier to line up and sew as opposed to some of the other more traditional princess seams. It's still the same amount of dart fullness being taken out along this style line as any other princess seam. It's not like the fit necessarily changes much. It's just easier to sew, so why not? So I will sew that front princess seam, the first one here in my shantung, and then both of them in my lining. I don't know why I only pinned one of the shantung. Doing left and right, not in the same round. Don't know what that's about. But I will, of course, clip my curves over the bust on this and then press open my seam allowances using my tailor's ham to help me out with that, especially over the curve of the bust here. And this fabric, again, is super crispy, so I'm not worried about anything moving around much, because once I press it, it presses very well and it stays where I press it. And I'll clip the curves and press open the seam allowance for my lining as well. Then I can pin the other side of my front princess seam here. Take that over the machine. Same order of operations here. But seeing as I already have both fronts sewn together and pressed open for my lining, I can go ahead and match up my shoulder seams and my side seams here. That way I can stitch these together in this next round of sewing over at the machine. I do like to batch process as much as possible. Helps me keep in the flow of things. That way I can come over here to the machine and sew everything I just pinned for this next round. This fabric does come in a red colorway that I have not managed to nip down and purchase yet. I grabbed this metallic shantung from Allen's here in Denver. So if you are in Denver and you nab the last of it, I will be sad. So don't do that to me. I do wish this shantung came in even more colors. It's actually, while it frays quite badly, mostly it's really nice to work with. Again, because it just molds to any shape you want very easily. I love a good crispy fabric, like a taffeta or a shantung, honestly. But I wish this came in like a black blend, because of course this is aqua blended with gold and black, but I would love like a pewter blended with gold and black. I do have a similar fabric that is actually a silk version that I did pick up at Alfredi's. Once again, they had a cobalt blue and gold sort of version of this shantung. I think that one is a taffeta, so it doesn't have slubs the way that a shantung does. Very similar types of fabric for those of you who are unfamiliar with silks and faux silks. Shantung it's more similar to a dupioni. It has a little bit of variance in the thickness of the threads, which gives it a slight like organic baby stripe to it. Not necessarily stripes, but a bit of a stripy texture because of the variance in the thickness of the threads, as opposed to a taffeta, which is completely smooth. All the threads are the same width or like thickness. There's of course a lot of variance in fabric, but I don't think most people use as many metallics and fancy fabrics as I do. Again, as usual, people always ask me where I wear these things, and the answer is I currently have nowhere to wear them, but I hope to in the future, you know? Dress for the life you want. Future me lives very close to like theater, ballet, opera, that kind of thing. I don't know where, but that's what I hope for her, and that's the wardrobe I create. I try not to limit my ideas to just things I have a place to wear, because lucky for me, and I am very lucky, this is my job, is to demonstrate sewing, so you know, I kind of let my ideas run wild sometimes, and it creates a lot of metallic clothing that way. But you've just been seeing me clip my curves and press everything open for both the lining and the shantung. And then I have started pinning the underarm seams for all of my sleeve pieces, both the undersleeves and the oversleeves. Of course, I need to put gathering stitching into the oversleeves at both the sleeve cap and the hem of that, so you'll see that momentarily. And then since my front princess seams are sewn for my shantung layer, I can go ahead and do the side seams and the shoulder seams for the outside layer, shantung layer as well, just as I did for the lining. I can also go ahead and attach my peplum pieces, the fronts to the back at the side seams, seeing as I for some reason neglected to do so earlier. And I'll go ahead and put the peplum lining together as well, again in this sort of antique golden olive color, attaching the side seams of that. This still needs to be sewn together the center back as well, but we'll get to it. By the end, I always hope that anything I've forgotten becomes clear in at least seeing the garment in its finished state. But here's my bigger puff sleeves here, and again, need to sew this underarm seam. And once again with this project, you can see I'm trying to remember to remove my pins so that I don't get in trouble. That's right. Although I did make a linen project this week, and I was sewing over my pins with abandon because linen doesn't care at all, and neither does the machine. So fancier fabrics, anything with lurex, because lurex is not a fiber in the same way as many other things, even with polyester fabrics, a lot of times, or acetate, nylon, things like that, the fibers are made to behave like a natural fiber would, or extruded into a shape that is similar to a natural fiber. Whereas lurex is often, like, if you imagine a Christmas, like a papery, plasticky Christmas ribbon, like that bows are made out of for Christmas time, or tinsel, like plastic tinsel for your Christmas tree, shrunk down to even smaller size. But that does mean that they're kind of a flat ribbon. So if the needle gets dull at all and hits one of those little tiny ribbon threads, it does jostle them out of place in the weave a lot faster than any other fiber I work with. I would say lurex is the most sensitive of fibers that I work with, here in my studio at least. And I do work with lurex quite a lot because, again, we know I love my metallics. And I really do. I do love some shiny fabric. And of course I need to start pressing everything for that last round. This is a subtle curve along the hip, along the side seam of these peplum pieces here, but it's subtle enough I didn't need to clip it, which is nice. It's also on the bias because of the center front and center back being cut along the straight grain. So because it's along the 45-degree angle, the sides do flex a little bit more. So that helps with being able to press this curve without having to clip it. And of course the side seams on my bodice pieces here are just straight, so those are easy enough to press. But the shoulder seams do have that curve in them, so I have to clip that curve before I can press my shoulder seams flat. And luckily this aqua color fabric does match a lot of the things that I made earlier in the year for Verdigris quite well. So I have the Verdigris bug jacket, the matching skirt for that in that sort of, again, acetate wool lurex blend brocade. This fabric here, I'll put it up on screen. That pencil skirt actually goes very well with this bodice as well. So that's always useful. Of course, olive green or camel or dark green I think would look good with this aqua colored bodice. I actually have my undersleeves in the lining all finished up here. I have pressed the hem of those a ½ just so that it's ready to go for later. I will be hand finishing the hem on that later. But I do need to put all my gathering stitching into my puff sleeves before I can, of course, gather those down to fit into this garment. But I will go ahead and start working on the sleeves and the peplum kind of in tandem here. So I'm just going to kind of bag line the peplumy bit of this, and then it will hang out in between the two layers while I bag line the rest of the jacket later. So hopefully you will see what I mean. But I like to line up all the seam lines first and then pin in between, in case either fabric wants to stretch a little bit. This is how I like to pin stuff, I guess. If you've ever been watching me, you'll have seen me do it this way. And I will go ahead and stitch that over here on the machine, and then again, yes, put the gathering into my puff sleeves, putting 2 lines of gathering stitching. This is the largest stitch length on my machine, which for me is 6 stitches per inch. Always so hard to say. Too many like sounds going on there. But I will put 2 lines of gathering stitching into the sleeve cap and along the sleeve hem for those puffed over sleeves. But yes, as I speak to you now, I have just come back from a little bit of a break where I was playing some video games and trying to take a little bit of a breather. I also did take this last week to work slowly on the linen version of the gown that I made with you last time here on the channel. So I do have the linen top version of that coming soon. It's almost done. I just have to finish the front closures of that. I'm trying to kind of slowly get back into sewing after this marathon that I did for Arcana. I lost a little bit of my sewing power. I still have plenty of ideas. I just, for some reason, once I start trying to get going in the sewing room, I get distracted easily. So I let myself take that project rather slow on my week off. I call it a week off, and yet I still made something and filmed it, but you know, it counts. I'll clip my corners and curves and turn this right side out, but I'll actually pause turning this right side out and put a bit of understitching in here. So I'm stitching the seam allowance down to the lining side, and this will be folded and pressed to the inside, and this kind of helps it stay onto the inside. So a bit of understitching in here. You can see I can't go right up to the points in this, you know, very pointy peplum, but I can do as much as I can here before I turn this right side out and give it a nice crispy press. Alright, my peplum is all assembled here basically. One last little press here to keep everything nice and crispy. I'm actually going to put a little bit of top stitching here into this front edge, which will line up with top stitching I do on the front edge of the rest of the jacket later. So you'll see that near the end of the video, but for now I'm just going to pin this into place, and I can throw some top stitching in there in a moment. But before that I can go ahead and start layering my undersleeves and my oversleeves together. So I need to basically gather down the oversleeve to fit this undersleeve. So I'll line up my underarm seam between the 2 layers here. Of course I have them right sides together. Then I'm going to find the center of each sleeve and line those up, just to keep my gathering slightly spaced out here along the cuff. I am sewing the cuffs of these together first. And I will go ahead and pull on my gathering threads and gather all of this excess down to the undersleeve. I do believe this is the same way that I put the sleeves together for the 1890s costuming projects I did here on the channel, so hard to remember what the heck I was up to, despite having, done it a couple of times and watched myself do it quite often because I was editing those videos as well. And again, you can start to see here how this looks like a balloon, basically. The fabric really holds, this crispy fabric really holds the shape, no problem. I didn't need to put any stuffing or anything in these sleeves to help them puff, because even the little amount of puff I added to them started creating these little balloon sleeves, no problem, because this fabric is so structured. But you can see here, this is where the fabric started to fray on me a little bit more violently than it had in any other part of the project. And you'll see when I take this over to the machine to try and sew it, it creates a little bit of trouble, all these threads poking out and escaping. Luckily, it was all fine in the end. It's all within the seam allowance, but it just creates a little bit of anxiety while sewing this stuff, basically. While pinning and sewing, I suppose. I'm just going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the finished seam and only about 4 inches past the center point, just for a little bit of top stitching on this. Again, this fabric is so metallic that it almost looks like metal plating or armor once it's sewn together, and so I don't mind top stitching on it. I feel like it kind of gives it a finished effect. Some people don't like top stitching. Obviously, I'm on team top stitching. I use it quite a lot in my sewing. And then I will go ahead and try and sew this darn sleeve cuff with all these little threads poking out, causing trouble that I have to kind of pause and snip a few every once in a while because everything's wanting to get tangled, but all is well that ends well. And back over here, I can go ahead and clip some of those threads, turn this right side out, so you can see what this looks like. I have a smaller sleeve and I have a puffier sleeve, and I'm going to stick the undersleeve inside here. And that is kind of where the sleeve structure is, and then the puff sits on top of it and is just allowed to do its thing and be a big balloon of sleeve, but without being hollow against my arm, I guess. And again, I will find the center of my sleeve cap and the undersleeve cap. The undersleeve cap doesn't have any gathering, but this outer puff sleeve does, so this will have a little bit more gathering along the top of the sleeve into the shoulder later, so you'll see that. I had to do the other sleeve the same way, of course. And then I layered my bodice onto my peplum, and again I'm matching up my side seams, my center back seams, matching up seams first. And again, the peplum in the front only goes to the princess seam on either side, so it doesn't go all the way to the center front. So I'm keeping that in mind, making sure to line up everything properly along the waist here. Back over to the machine, stitch that into place. As you're watching this, I'm actually having a very unexpected day out. Should be out of the office all day today as this video goes live, so hopefully nothing is going catastrophically wrong with it and you're having a good time here. But I am certainly having a good time today, and you will see why shortly. Clip my curves, press that seam allowance, and I'll finish up these sleeves. I don't know why I was going back and forth from working on different parts of this in the sleeves. I guess puff sleeves always make me a little bit anxious. I don't know why. Especially when they're got a mind of their own like these. I'm going to pin the underarm and the centers together again and then gather down the outer sleeve to fit the inner sleeve. I will then layer on the cap sleeve as well, and honestly baste the whole darn thing together because too many layers at this point. Things can go wrong. And then I will set the whole balloon into my garment once everything's all layered together, kind of making the jacket itself separately from making the sleeves, and the sleeves kind of go in last. But I will layer on my little sleeve cap doohickey, just this little bit of extra ornamentation right here at the shoulder seam. Now I've basted all that together so that I don't have to worry about any of my layers coming apart when I set these sleeves into the garment itself. And I was thinking, oh, it would be nice to have little tucks here actually in the underarm to make that even puffier. It was at this point I was thinking, I could have made these sleeves puffier, huh? A note for next time. But I'll go ahead and set these in, again matching up the underarms and the centers of my shoulder seam and sleeve first here, and then pinning in between. So these are set in all nice and smooth into the outside of this garment. I will have to set in the sleeve lining into the lining separately. So technically there'll be one more layer on these very layered sleeves. And magically the other side is already done. That side I prepared earlier. It's like a cooking program. I will put a couple of clips into the underarm seam allowance of this, just so that it's not too tight on my body because this fabric doesn't have a lot of flex to it. And I'll go ahead and press the seam allowance into the inner part of the sleeve as much as I can manage with a little steam. And yes, setting my lining sleeves into the rest of the lining here before I can bag line the rest of the garment here, finishing the neckline in doing so. And once that lining is all together, I will start by pinning the back neckline of my garment together. Again, right sides together. I'm just going to be bag lining this, going ahead and pinning all the seams together first, right sides together, making sure that seam allowance is open so nothing gets caught. I think there's one spot on this that it does get caught, which if you're watching very carefully and slow me down maybe, you can catch when I'm clipping my curves and corners in a moment. But yes, I'm flipping the peplum, which is already attached to the outside of the fabric, inside of this big pillow that I'm creating, jacket-shaped pillow, so that while I'm bag lining the rest of this, the peplum is just chilling in between the layers, and it'll get sewn again along this waistline as I'm sewing the waist of the outer garment and the lining together. And I'm just leaving a hand-sized opening along the center back waistline of this as a way to turn this right side out in a moment. But otherwise I will bag line the whole thing. Same half-inch seam allowance I've been using this whole time, same 12 stitches per inch over here on the machine. Take all my pins out here, then of course I can clip my corners and my curves before I start turning this right side out, and all those extra threads and weird things that are hanging out. This lining is really quite pretty. I am a fan. I wish I had some more of it. Next time I'm in Boulder. I actually don't go to Boulder very often, which is a bummer because they have a lot of good restaurants. Clipping those corners, clipping my curves. The waistline is actually already clipped, so I don't have to worry about that. I'll turn this right side out, give everything a nice press, and then I will pin that opening shut along the back there, and I will just slip stitch that by hand. I will also slip stitch the little opening I have left here by hand, same as up here on the collar, and I will actually hand stitch the lining into place along the cuff of the sleeve as well. So this extra layer of sleeve lining is really only here to help finish the armscye seam on the inside, because of course the armscye is now encased between the lining and the fashion fabric, which is nice and much more comfortable than having to sew it in there. And that's also why I'm doing this sleeve hem by hand, is because I'd rather do the hem of the sleeve by hand than do the armscye by hand, which you've seen me do in some other videos. It's just not the most fun thing ever, but sometimes is necessary when you have a shaped hem. But when the sleeve hem is just flat like this, no problem doing it this way instead. Then I'm going to continue on from the top stitching I did earlier on the peplum piece, starting where I left off on there, and then coming up all the way along the front, up along the neckline, up the back collar, back down around the other side to meet up with the peplum on the other side. So I'm just putting my top stitching in here, but doing it strategically so that everything lines up and looks purposeful. I believe that's really the thing with top stitching, is as long as it is an accent and is purposeful, I think it looks good. If you are putting in as like a save, I think sometimes you can tell that you were trying to save something with top stitching as opposed to having it be a detail you planned in from the start. The real key there is if something's looking bulky or weird, make sure that the top stitching is extra decorative, or that you put trim on top of it or something like that, so that again it looks intentional. You know, it doesn't have to have been originally intended, as long as in the end it looks intentional. And for top stitching I do use 10 stitches per inch as opposed to 12, just a little bit larger stitch length so that again it looks purposeful. And look at that, we have a garment. It's nearly all together. Well, it is all together. We need some sort of center front closure, and of course all those little bits, like my sleeve hems and things, still need to be hand sewn shut. So I'll take this over to my computer desk, sit and watch an episode of QI or something, and hand stitch all those bits that need to be stitched, and then I can figure out what I'm going to do for my center front closure on this. So I'm going to just do hook and eyes down the center front of this, but I will want a placket behind those just to make everything nice and finished, since there's no gaps or seeing my blouse or whatever underneath. Down the center front of this, behind my hook and eyes. So I'll throw a quick placket together, just using the rest of that olive colored silk and some more of my aqua here. As you can see, I threw some fusible interfacing in there. This is just going to finish up at around 2 inches wide and maybe, I don't know, 14 inches long. I usually make these plackets kind of like extra long, and then just trim it down to whatever finish size I feel I need after I play with it, pinning it to the front of the garment. And because this edge is top stitched already, I'm just going to stitch in that ditch. So I'm going to stitch right along the top stitching once again to stitch this placket down, because no one will notice that there's an extra line of stitching over my top stitching unless they're looking exceedingly close and they need to move backwards. Keep at least 6 feet away from me. Thank you very much. And here's what that looks like all finished up, with the placket sewn in place and my hook and eyes all sewn on, ready to be able to wear this bodice. And here is the finished aqua shantung evening bodice once again. Again, it's sort of a short sleeve jacket. It's not really a top. It's too stiff to be a blouse. It's inspired by historic pieces anyway, so might as well just keep on calling it a bodice and you'll know what I mean. I really am looking forward to making a few tweaks to this pattern, changing it up just a little bit to make a day wear version in a black cotton pique, something a little bit more appropriate for wearing out and about, and of course will match everything in my wardrobe because we all know how I love black clothing. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this evening version came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!